Well, William Harrison Crowder, to give him his full name, was my mother's father, and he was born in Lincolnshire, a place called Thimbleby, in 1894, and he was one of three children, all of whom were red-headed and all of whom, interestingly, were born in April. His brother was Robert, and his older sister, was Grace. He attended school locally in Horncastle until he reached about the age of 13 when he was moved into Lincoln School up on the Ragby Road in Lincoln. He was never really an academic and never really a great sportsman. His passion really was acting, and I think if circumstances had been different, things had turned out differently, he might actually have ended up as an actor. Because after he was married between the wars, he spent a lot of time in amateur dramatics in the Horncastle area. However, he left school and trained to join the family firm of Crowders in Thimbleby, which is a nursery and still there today, run by my cousin Robert. After training, he joined the firm, and then, of course, in 1914, war broke out, and for a while, he continued to work at the nursery without any thought of joining up. But eventually, he began to see these long lists in the papers of people being killed and names of people he knew, and he became extremely guilty about the whole thing and sneaked off and joined up without telling his parents, which apparently caused an absolute uproar when they found out about it. Anyway, he went off to training with the Lincolnshire Yeomanry in various parts of the country, and it wasn't until 1917, I think, that he went out to join the action in France. Following the war, he got married in 1920 to Violet, my grandmother, Violet Pearson, who'd been a VAD nurse in the First World War. And then they started their family, my mother and two sisters she has, Anne and Janet, and a brother Bill. And Grandpa ran the family firm through until retirement, when his son Bill took it on. I was born in 1948, so my grandfather was in his mid-50s at that time. And I remember him as a really jolly gentleman, a very robust character, not somebody that you'd push around. And in fact, that was illustrated by a little story of something that happened to him at school. The whole family, his brother and his sister, were all redheads. And when he joined Lincoln School, he was ragged rather badly about being a ginger. And he sorted that one out by having a fight with the main person who was shouting rude things at him. Had a fight with him around the back of the Fives Court, won it, and gained respect. So Grandpa was a guy you could tell was not to be pushed about, but he was a really friendly, gregarious, fun-loving chap. He was when I look back at it, I seem to think that really his formative years were spent in the sunny uplands, as it were, of the Edwardian era, and he never lost that. Even the war didn't affect his attitude towards life, his desire to enjoy it to the full. Well, he lived all his life, with a short period of early marriage when his mother was still alive, in the same house on the nurseries at Thimbleby. It was a converted agricultural workers, two cottages actually, converted together and extended into a Victorian villa. So he lived there until he got married, and I'm not sure whether they bought, but they certainly rented a house in Edlington, which is where he and Violet spent their first few years of married life, before his father died in 1922, and then he moved into the family house after his mother had built the house at Hillside across the road from the nurseries. He was obviously concerned to bring his children up in the best possible environment, and I think he was a fairly relaxed. I don't think he was a terribly disciplinarian father. But the play acting side of things extended into what they used to call gypsy picnics, and everybody used to dress up from a box in sort of pseudo gypsy gear and wander off into the fields around the back of the nursery for picnics in the hay fields. Even the staff, they'd take staff with them, sort of dressed up. They didn't look too happy about it from some of the photographs I've seen. And they used to sleep out as well on balmy summer's nights. And Mother recalls how the family would all. She didn't always join them. She was a bit, she decided she preferred the comfort of her bed. But on an odd occasion, when she joined them in the summer months, sometimes in wartime, they'd sleep on the tennis court, and the family would be one side of the net, and staff would be the other. Oh dear, which always makes me smile. So yes, they and friends and family would join in. One particular great friend of Bill Crowder's, my uncle's, was Chris Lawrence, who was the son of the local vicar, Peter Lawrence, who was vicar at the church at Thimbleby.
Well, he was a wonderful father, very affectionate, very humorous, and very attentive to his children, and wanted them to have the best of everything. The most important thing I would remember about Will Crowder is his tolerance of two quite naughty boys, one of them, particularly me, rather naughtier than the other. So we did quite a lot of damage one way or another. We used to borrow, there's a flatbed truck, they had a wheeling truck, and the nurseries were on the side of the hill, and there was a nice path all the way down, so you could take the wheel at the top and you could get on the truck, on the wheel flatbed truck, and career down to the bottom, and then careful not to run into the greenhouses, the grass houses in the bottom of it, or into the bushes. And I suppose that one good example of his tolerance was when Bill and I went up into the one of the storerooms where there were lots of bags of seeds. And we had this idea we could lower one of the bags of seeds through the trap door on a pulley and drop it to the floor, which would be fun to do. So we manoeuvred this great sack of seeds and got it over the door, over the trap door, and then we tried to let it down gently, and of course it was too heavy for us, and down it went with a great crash and split open, and there were seeds of some precious plant or other all over the floor of the barn. And then Will Crowder, we were hiding upstairs, and Will Crowder came in, looked at this mess and swore and cussed and cleared it all up, but never mentioned it to us afterwards. He knew perfectly well who'd done it. It was like that with occasional broken window panes on the glass houses. He also indulged us completely in whatever we chose to feed on. I can remember when it was the plum harvest or fruits of various kind or tomatoes, we were allowed freedom of the nurseries, and he never inquired into what we'd been taking.
He and Bill were just like brothers, and they'd get up to all sorts of hijinks. They built a boat on one occasion, a reasonable, not a model, a full size that they could get in, that they could take up to the Bain at Sherman's Wath, which was about a mile away. And they built this thing out of scraps of wood that they got from wherever. And then they decided there was no way it would float unless they corked all the joints. And what would you cork the joints with but tar? Well, how are you going to, melt the tar in order to get it into the joints? Oh, no problem. We'll ask Mother, that's my grandmother, whether they could melt the tar on the kitchen range in the actual kitchen at Thimbleby.
Oh gosh, yes. Bill set fire to the kitchen that time. He was burning pitch on the. They had one of these old-fashioned stoves and an open fire, and Bill was trying to melt some pitch on there and set fire to the kitchen. Oh dear, that's a dreadful story. I did all the watching and Bill did all the work. It was usually the way it was arranged. And so he built this great flat-bottom boat with upright sides and a back and covered it with pitch while I watched interestedly from there. And then on a very, very hot summer's day, we put it on pram wheels and wheeled it all the way up the Lincoln Road and down to Sherman's Wharf, where the Bain was. And we hadn't realised, of course, that very hot sun and the pitch was melting. So when we finally got it onto the grass to tip down into the stream, it stuck on the grass. And while Bill was at the other end in the water, I was trying to get it off the grass, and I pulled the back off this boat, and then I couldn't stop laughing, and the more I laughed, poor Bill, the more furious he got. My last memory of that is bits and pieces of this poor old boat floating down a stream and Bill dancing on the water. I was a very unpleasant boy, I'm afraid. Yes, well, Chan, the lady who looked after us, I can't remember, I don't know if she had a title in the household, but she was effectively the nanny. And she had a great big box of clothes. And so when it came to gypsy picnic time, we all had to be dressed up in these clothes. And Chan would have a great basket of lovely food and stuff to put in it. And then we would go down to one of the fields the other side of the road and enjoy this picnic. All great fun. Made it very special to be dressed up as gypsies, we thought.
Grace was educated in, similar to most young ladies of that era, at a private school in Woodhall Spa, Miss Lunn's, I think it was called. On leaving school, she lived with her mother as a companion, basically. I'm trying to think what she would have done. She must have been at home. She was at home during the war, and she drove her father about to the various markets, Spilsby and Louth, etc., where he needed to do work. So she either drove him in the car, which was an enormous, great American Studebaker, or if there wasn't petrol, I think she drove him in a horse and trap. After the war, once great-grandpa had died in 22, she and her mother moved into the house at Hillside, and she effectively was housekeeper, companion to her mother. And it wasn't until, I think, 1937 or 38 that she eventually got married to William Brown, who was the bank manager at Lloyd's in Horncastle. Now, William had been married to Grace's aunt, and who was the wife of an hotelier who was fairly well to do. Anyway, the aunt fell ill, and Grace went as a dutiful niece to nurse her in her final days, and that's how William got to know her. Anyway, they married. William eventually was moved to, I think his last role as a bank manager was at Dorchester, and they spent their early married life in Dorchester, and then eventually bought a large detached house in a very small village of Sutton Points, which is about 2 or 3 miles up in the hills from Weymouth. They lived there in some style. Thimbleby Church was about a mile from Thimbleby Nurseries, where Grandpa lived. St Margaret's Church is quite a small but significant building within the village of Thimbleby, which is thatch and mud and stud cottages. Beautiful, one of the most photographed villages in Thimbleby, I think. And the church was a significant part of Crowder's life. My great-grandfather was a member of the committee which was looking after the building, the fabric of the building. My grandfather took that role on, My uncle Bill also was involved in looking after the church, and I believe Grandpa's sister Grace was also interested in the building and the preservation of it, and provided some money towards it. Um, after the war, I think it was about 1920. There was the family commissioned a firm of stained glass window manufacturers. Heaton Butler and Bain were based in London, quite an important firm, I think, to produce a window in memory of Robert, who was killed at Passchendaele in 1917. And it's a two-part window with a figure of Christ on the left-hand side and two soldiers in medieval armour on the right-hand side. One soldier is kneeling and represents Robert in washed-out colours to indicate there is no life left. The soldier standing behind him is in solid colour, represents my grandfather, and the fact that he's standing and in solid colour represents the fact that he survived the war. They both got red hair, obviously. And this was, as I say, a dedication which is fairly unusual and must have cost a considerable amount of money. So it showed, it's another illustration really of the effect that Robert's death, and also at the time, in the spring of 1918, when my grandfather went missing, the family must have thought they'd lost both boys. And it wasn't until 2 or 3 weeks after the 21st of March in 1918 that a letter came through to explain that Grandpa actually survived and was a prisoner of war. But at the time, the family must have been absolutely, completely devastated. And this memorial window is still there in the church. He didn't speak to anyone really about the war, certainly not before the Second World War. And I think that was in common with many old soldiers who just either wanted to shut it away because it was too horrific to remember, or they felt that people weren't interested. And I think Grandpa felt that his family weren't interested. And the same thing with the family. They felt that he wasn't interested enough to tell them the story. But when you read a lot about the war and the effect it had on people who took part, you realise that how can you possibly talk to somebody about standing up to your neck in mud for hours on end, shooting at people who are shooting back at you, and all your chums are being either killed or maimed beside you. It's something that's very difficult to share with a civilian who's never had that experience. And I think it was just after the Second War that Grandpa decided to go to one or two military reunions. And my mother tells the story that my father commented that how good that was possibly for him to actually be able to share the experience with people who'd actually experienced something similar. So that's why we knew obviously that he'd been decorated because he had his DSO medal hanging on the wall of his dressing room, along with the citation, which unfortunately was stolen in a robbery shortly after he died. The house was broken into, and those were the main things that were stolen. So we knew a little bit about what he'd done in the war, and we knew that he'd been a key element in that particular day of the German spring offensive, sending back the information, which the brigade couldn't glean any other way. He spoke to me very briefly on occasion about things. I remember him telling me about how shrapnel was still coming out, popping up to the surface of his skin, and little lumps of metal coming out. My first trip to France was in 1966, and I landed in Dunkirk and hitchhiked around northern France. And one of the first places I stopped at was Douai. So I sent a postcard to Grandpa saying I'd arrived in Douai. And when I got back, he said that brought back memories because Douai was the place that the Germans put him on a train and sent him off into Germany on his route across to the prison camp. So there were little snippets, but he never really sat down and told us anything in great detail. And it wasn't until about 10 years ago I was talking to my mother about Grandpa's. I don't know what it was that made me raise the subject, but I was just thinking about his medals and wondering whether we could ever find them. And she said, "Well, you better look at this letter." And she showed me a letter she'd written to a man who was an historian and employed by, I think it was Sunderland Polytechnic as an historian professor, who in the 1970s had set himself the task of interviewing as many of the men who were still alive who'd taken part in the trenches. And he'd found Grandpa through a book which had been written by a Lincolnshire man called The Kaiser's Last Battle, I think it was the title. And there were 2 or 3 little pieces about Grandpa's activities on that particular day, on the 21st of March 1918. And this chap had read them and sought Grandpa out and had been in correspondence with him.
May 1976. Dear Mr. Crowder, I do hope I have got your name correctly. I am a senior lecturer in history at Sunderland Polytechnic, and I'm conducting a research project entitled 1914 to 18 Personal Experience Archive, the nature and purpose of which is to preserve both recollected and original evidence of personal experience in the Great War. I would like to write to ask if you would help me with my work. If you feel you can help me, I shall be honoured and delighted. Most sincerely, Peter H. Liddell.
And Mother said that she knew that the chap had tried to come up one weekend to talk to Grandpa and stay with him, but unfortunately it hadn't worked out. And when she discovered that there'd been a burglary and and the DSO medal had disappeared, she decided to write to this chap just in case Grandpa had sent it on to his archive. So she wrote to him, and he wrote back saying how sorry he was to hear that Grandpa had died and the burglary, and no, there hadn't been. He hadn't deposited the medal with him. There was some discussion back in the 70s between Grandpa and my mother about my grandmother's autograph book. She got into the habit in those days at school of getting autographs from her fellow pupils, and she kept an autograph book, a leatherette one, and she kept it up all the way through her life. And what's of particular interest from the point of view of the First World War is that she had signatures and all kinds of entries from the soldiers that she'd been treating in Horncastle. And it's a fascinating record, because obviously each man is different. So some just signed their names with best wishes. One actually did a portrait of Violet, a rather wonderful little watercolour drawing.
How long have I got?
1 minute.
Alf's been wanting to take Nurse Pearson's portrait. She never keeps still, though. None of you do.
You boys keep us rushed off our feet.
Nurse Violet, the Tommy's favourite. Will you not stay with me a little longer? But if you go, I will die.
You'll manage well enough, Trooper Farm. Just don't expect to play football for a while.
And Grandpa had actually mentioned en passant to my mother that he thought of handing that on to this chap Liddell, and she'd said under no circumstances. So anyway, she showed me the letter that she'd got back from Peter. And I thought, well, I wonder what else he knows that I don't know and we don't know about Grandpa. So I looked him up on Google, as you do these days, and I found a reference to the Little Library or Little Archive, which was held at the University of Leeds. So I thought, well, must be the same man. So I made contact with them and said, did they have anything on W.H. Crowder? And they wrote back amazingly. So they got 3 files, one on William, one on his brother Robert, and one on Violet, my grandmother. So I then rang them up and said, well, copy it to me. So I paid quite a lot of money to have it all copied and sent to me, and it arrived one Saturday morning. Sorry, it was quite emotional. This enormous, great package arrived, and I just stopped doing everything and just sat and read it that morning. And I have to say, it hit me. It hit me enormously hard, because Grandpa had written. He'd sat down about 3 or 4 years before he died. Unfortunately, he got dementia, and but before that, he'd sat down and religiously every day had written in his own handwriting in a school exercise book his personal history and his memoirs of the war, quite detailed and beautifully written. And he'd written them the way he spoke, so I could hear him standing behind me as I read.
My name is William Harrison Crowder, and I was born in 1894 in Thimbleby in Lincolnshire. I had an older sister, Grace, and a younger brother, Robert. As children, we had plenty of room to play in the garden and the nursery, and in the fields around the village. It was in the spring of 1915 when, at the age of 21, I eventually got around to joining up. I had been very unhappy about not being in the forces, especially when the names of young fellows I knew or knew of began to appear in the lengthening casualty lists. At that time I had acquired a Douglas motorbike on which I was never very safe, although I did take it with me to my first billet in Lincoln, only 20 miles from home. Eventually I decided that somehow I had to go out to the front. My younger brother Robert had been called up and had gone off in the artist rifles. I put in for a commission to the gunners. After training, I was instructed to proceed to Le Havre. There we were directed to a large camp on the outskirts of the town. Someone came up to me and said, "You're lucky, you're posted to the 51st Division." In my ignorance, I said, "What's that?" And he replied, "A famous Scottish division. It's a storm division, always being pushed into the hottest part of the line." At first, when I joined the division, I found it difficult to understand what the men in the trenches were saying, and I did not like at all being in the Scottish division.
Right, who are you? How are you doing?
All right, yeah. So do you not ken a word that we're saying?
But after I had been with them for a few weeks, I would not have changed with anyone. Rumours were rife, and it was reported that the Germans would attack us on the 12th of March. However, that date passed without anything happening. The next date tipped was the 21st of March, and this sounded authentic. The day before, I was informed that I was to man the night OP of Gosling in the forward trench of the front line. There was very little sleep for me or my 3 telephonists on the night of March the 20th, 1918. A catnap or two, but we were mainly very much on the qui-vive, and the atmosphere was intense. I think that although we had no means of knowing what the morrow would bring, we were in a way relieved that at last something was going to happen.
Don't know how anyone can get any sleep on a night like this. It's too quiet.
Yeah, know what you mean. Can't stand it.
It's that fog that's the worst thing. It's eerie. You can't hear through it.
Yeah.
The Boche could be right there, right at our door, listening to our every word. We'd never know.
Well, you're in luck, aren't you? They wouldn't understand your accent.
They'd understand it better than you, pal.
No, that's not fair.
I can understand at least half of what you say to me now.
Don't worry, sir. He's got nothing worthwhile to say anyway.
That's not very nice, is it? Anyway, what are you doing awake?
Well, I heard you complaining, so I thought I'd try and boost the morale.
What's it like out there?
Quiet, as always.
Quiet, aye. Well, that's not done much to lift our spirits.
No, I suppose not. Did you... Oh my God.
They're right on top of us!
No, it wasn't that close.
That was close enough.
Right then, chaps. No sleep for us tonight. Let's take a look.
Violence started.
Very early in the morning, the bombardment grew in intensity, as if all hell had been let loose. The extraordinary thing was that I experienced no fear, just a kind of strange elation.
Sir! Where you been, sir? Stand to worry.
Just been to the lookout. Couldn't see anything.
Really, sir? You'd have gone a long time. We thought there'd been a call.
Yes, well, it was a call of sorts.
New orders, sir?
No, not that kind of call. More of a call of nature.
Sir? Oh, sir! The bombardment!
Yes, I'm afraid so.
Those shells! When you worried?
Yes, I did think it would be rather undignified to die with my trousers down.
Ah, no worries, sir. We're your loyal to liveness. We'll pull your breeks up and say nothing to anybody.
Right.
All the time I kept going up into the lookout to see what, if anything, was happening, and to report back. I had always imagined that I should see some sort of fight in front of us, with our men fighting the Germans, but it was so misty and I had to wear one of those horrible gas masks that I saw nothing, just the occasional figure. I kept bobbing up and observing, and bobbing down and reporting. I could just see a few figures in the mist, but I couldn't tell which side they were on. Then bullets came over our heads, and I reported this. This state of affairs went on until, I suppose, about 9 o'clock in the morning, when I was told by the brigade HQ that they had sent an officer, ostensibly as my relief.
Sir, the conditions here are not... Yes, I understand, but will he be able to get to us? The bombardment is... Yes, sir. Acknowledged. We'll do our very best. Over and out.
So, what's the news? Is the relief coming?
Well, yes and no.
Sir?
They sent a fresh officer from England. He's on his way, but given his experience and the conditions... It's an inferno out there. How could anyone survive it?
You made it through earlier, sir. Taking that message out through the trenches.
That I did.
I can't explain why. Strange, isn't it, that one should be fearless in such a situation? And you may think that I am, well, this is bravado of some sort. It wasn't bravery, I can tell you that. I was just following orders. I didn't think of it as anything brave or anything to fear, just something that had to be done.
Right, come on, we've got some work to do to keep those reports coming.
Second Lieutenant Stewart reporting. I believe I'm supposed to be your relief.
Lieutenant William Crowder. You did bloody well to get here. Right, let's look at that scratch. Right. Come on, make yourself at home. Sort you out.
When the mist began to clear away, I saw figures of men near to where our lines were, but they were not distinct enough for me to be sure whether they were ours or the enemy. I was not in doubt long.
Get back inside! We need to report this to HQ!
And in a short time we heard men moving about in the trench between us and our rear guard.
Yes, sir. They're between us and the rear guard. We're caught like rats in a trap. Yes, sir, I understand. Apparently, we're the only operating field telephone for miles. The bombardment has taken everything out. We're to hold this position for as long as possible, but be ready to cut that wire. You hear that? Is that German?
Yes. They're ordering the trench be cleared.
Be ready.
Aye, sir, ready.
I think they're right outside.
Yes, they are. They're moving around. Keep that line intact. Better report it. Yes, sir. Yes, they're here. We'll hold out as long as possible.
They're still moving about out there, sir. I don't think they're able to come down.
We got our boys firing at them. They'd still be fought off.
All the same, be ready to cut that wire. I'm going to take a look. Hello. Lieutenant William Crowder. Gosling up. Yes. They're coming over. In their thousands.
Did I hear that correctly? Thousands.
That's it then! Cut the wire! Sir? Now! Lieutenant Stewart, do you speak German?
Yes, sir.
Then would you kindly tell the Bosch that we wish to surrender?
Yes, sir, I'll do it.
Before I left the dugout to face the Germans, I found time to travel back to Thimbleby in my mind and to imagine what my father and mother would be doing on that Thursday morning. I also said a short prayer commending myself and the other fellows to God's mercy. I always took comfort in the fact that if I had done my best, there was nothing else to be done, and then it was, as it were, over to the Almighty. I'm glad to say I still possess my faith. I felt ghastly at this stage that I had let the side down. For days afterwards I kept worrying about what else I could have done, but I eventually came to realize that we couldn't have done much more.
What did he say, Lieutenant? He said that the war will be over by Christmas. I think they seem to think they've won.
There were some German wounded. I was glad to help carry one or two of them. Soon we started to move away from the battle area to behind the German lines.
My dear Mr. Crowder, I'm writing to you about your son, who was a subaltern in my battery. I would have written you sooner, but was unable to do so, as we had 6 days and nights continuous fighting, and we have been moving every day through the country. What happened was this. On the night of the 20th, your boy went to the observing post for my battery, accompanied by 3 signallers, all stout fellows. On the morning of the 21st, the Boche put down a tremendous artillery bombardment all along our position, and about 9 a.m. crossed no man's land and attacked us. The first news we had of the attack was from your son, who sent in most valuable information to the brigade headquarters and said that the Boche were attacking. Shortly afterwards, it must have been about 11 a.m, he reported to brigade, to whom there was a direct wire, that the Boche had passed his OP in large numbers and had thrown 2 bombs down. He still went on reporting till the wire was finally broken. I cannot remember which, but either the Daily Mail or Times or Morning Post told his story. He was the first to give any real information re the enemy's movements. Whether he is dead or alive, I cannot tell. The best I can hope, he is a prisoner. He was a very brave fellow, and we all miss him greatly. We had got to know and like him. He was a typical English country gentleman, straight and unaffected. And I pray God he is alive, and it's in my opinion an even chance that he is. Be sure and let me know if you hear from him, and if I can help, I'll do it. I know the exact spot he was last seen in. If anything should happen to me, I am recommending him, and he is sure to get a military cross at least. I do hope he'll be all right. Yours, very sincerely, Major John Scott.